Welcome everyone to part 3 of the COSO 2013 framework. In this session, we'll actually show you how to do the mapping process and what is required. So the first step is to identify the relevant key controls that are in place and input them into the control activity column. So in this case, as you remember from session 2, that we laid out the controls, the objectives, the principles, and the points of focus, and now we've, over the corner left side here, now listed each of our controls. And the next part that we do is we determine if the control maps to a particular point of focus and mark it in the box with a check mark if applicable. So we read our control wording, and then we go across to the various points of focus to see where does it, so here's our control wording. We then read across and see how does it match up? Does this seem to match this particular sets the tone at the top? And if it does, we've marked it with an X now. And once all the relevant key controls have been mapped to either a point of focus or a principle, we then verify that all the points of focus or principles have a control mapped to them by the summary count rows. So that's why in our building our mapping template, you can see where the arrows, we have a summary of the count of the principles to make sure that we've addressed each of the principles. That's where earlier I mentioned there are 17 principles. You have to make sure that you have controls to address at least all of the principles. Then more granular is the points of focus, and you can see here the various points of focus. We have different controls to address them. And the fourth step is evaluating the gaps. So are there any gaps in points of focus or principles? Are there any gaps in there? And if there are, you want to review the existing controls to confirm there is no process gap. Maybe it's just documentation and some of the wording has to be tweaked a bit so that it can map more directly into the principle or the points of focus. And if no control exists, then prepare a remediation plan, either adding a new control that we can implement to cover that, or to see maybe for your particular company, does it really, the point of focus, do you really need that point of focus? Or if the principle is already addressed, then maybe you don't need another control. But those are the 4 steps. Here's some additional considerations to think about. So the first one is that the new framework does not require that every point of focus be mapped to a control, only that the principles be mapped to a control. You might want to consider adding additional improvements or implementing new controls to meet the full objectives of the principles. Sometimes just the changing of the wording itself, expanding the wording can make it more clearly aligned to a principle. And ensuring that the controls that you map, this is really important, making sure the controls that we show up in this mapping are actually designed and operating effectively. We've had cases where clients will map controls into the COSO framework, but then 1 or 2 of those controls have failed or are deficiencies. And so even though you have something mapped to it, if it's not working effectively, you don't get credit for that. And so auditors will check for that, make sure we check into that. And finally, major deficiencies exist when management determines there's a component or 1 or more of the principles aren't present and functioning. So that's why we laid out the template so that we can easily identify if there are any missing components and making sure that all of the controls that we listed are operating effectively as well. So those are the additional considerations in this mapping process.